You've spent your entire life inside a lie so elegant, so convincing, that you mistook it for love. But the lie was never hers, it was yours. Otto Weininger, in his brutally honest and often uncomfortable work, Sex and Character, wrote that man does not seek a woman, he seeks the embodiment of his ideal. Not a partner, not a person, but a mirror, a projection, an escape from his own unfinished becoming. You weren't chasing her, you were chasing you, the version of you that you believe will finally exist once she chooses you. And that's the real tragedy. You didn't fall in love with her. You fell in love with the man you hoped you would become in her presence. You pinned your becoming to her acceptance. You built the illusion that if you could just become more successful, more powerful, more desirable, then, and only then, you would finally be worthy. But as Weininger warned, the man who is dependent upon the woman for the valuation of his life has already betrayed himself. And there it is. You are not a prisoner of her love. You are a prisoner of the image you crafted and called love. You built the body, the business, the reputation not for you, but for her gaze, and in doing so, you didn't build freedom. You built a gilded cage, a performance, a polished version of emptiness dressed up as purpose. And this is the genius of the trap, because the more you chase her as a path to yourself, the further you drift from who you really are. You thought the reward was her affection, but the real reward was never outside you to begin with. And the moment you wake up to that, everything changes. The lie men tell themselves, seeking validation through women. He builds his body, sharpens his career, learns to speak smoothly, all for a reason he won't admit. To be chosen, not to fulfill a mission, not to express his nature, but to be seen as worthy by a woman. And in that subtle shift from creation to validation, he betrays himself. It feels like love. It feels like effort. But beneath it all is the quiet self-deception that Otto Weininger warned of. When a man stops living for meaning and begins living for approval, he ceases to be free. This is not about demonizing love. This is about dissecting why some men love, and too often, it isn't love at all, it's projection. The woman becomes a mirror, not a partner. He doesn't love her as she is. He loves the reflection of himself she provides. The fantasy that if she chooses him, he's finally good enough. That illusion is intoxicating and utterly hollow. Carl Jung spoke of projection as a defense mechanism. When we cannot face our own inner emptiness, we attach our unlived potential to others. We see in them what we have not found in ourselves. The man who feels inadequate will seek the radiant woman not to know her, but to fill his own void. His love is not connection, it's compensation. And from that place, he begins to build a prison brick by brick with every compliment, every sacrifice, every silent expectation, a life that looks successful but feels hollow, a body that looks powerful but is used only to be noticed, a purpose that serves as theater, not as truth. And worse, he calls this prison romance. But the Stoics knew better. Marcus Aurelius said, "The approval of others should mean nothing to you if you approve of yourself. A man who is governed by self-respect will still love, but from freedom, not from hunger. He will serve, not to win affection, but to express his values. He will desire, not to prove his worth, but because he has already owned it." Validation is a drug, and like all addictions, it begins with pleasure and ends with pain. The man who builds his life to impress a woman becomes resentful when she doesn't give him the return he hoped for. He may never say it out loud, but the bitterness grows. I gave her everything. Why doesn't she see me? The answer is brutal, because you didn't build yourself to be seen, you built yourself to be approved. And approval is unstable. It shifts with mood, with novelty, with the winds of feminine energy. Meaning, on the other hand, is rooted. It does not depend on applause. That's why Weininger said the man who lives for female validation exchanges eternity for momentary pleasure. He gives up his mission for attention. He gives up his vision for a glance. And in that bargain, he loses the one thing that defines manhood: self-directed meaning. Imagine a man who trains not to impress, but because discipline shapes his soul, who speaks truth not to be liked, but because silence would be betrayal, who creates not for admiration, but because creation is his nature. This man is not unloving. He is simply uninterested in love that costs him his essence. So here's the question every man must face. Are you building your life to be worthy in your own eyes or in hers? Because if it's the latter, you may win her gaze for a moment, but you'll lose your own reflection forever. When a man abandons his mission to please a woman, he begins to vanish. He doesn't disappear all at once. He fades, slowly, quietly. First in the way he says yes when he means no, then in the way he puts off his passions, delays his plans, sacrifices his vision, telling himself it's love, that it's noble, that she'll see the depth of his devotion. But she doesn't see it as strength. She senses instead that something vital in him is slipping away. Otto Weininger called this the tragedy of man when he surrenders his individuality to win the approval of the feminine. He stops being a creator of meaning and becomes a performer for validation. And every act, though cloaked in romance, is a quiet act of self-erasure. He's no longer driven by a fire within. He's moving in reaction to her moods, her desires, her approval. At first, society celebrates him. What a good man, they say, so loving, so devoted. But what they applaud is often the death of his masculine essence. He has become what Weininger called reflected light, a man who no longer shines by his own flame, but reflects the image cast upon him. He's a moon, not a sun, a reaction, not a force. And that's why his life begins to lose momentum, because what he's building isn't rooted in truth. It's based on being liked. Carl Jung would say, this man is stuck in the persona, the socially accepted mask, while the self, his true identity, remains hidden, neglected, buried under layers of need. He may look stable on the outside, but inside, he's fragmented, because when you stop pursuing your mission to be chosen, you become unanchored. You drift from one emotion to another, one woman to another, one justification to another, never creating, only reacting. And what does this cost him? Everything. His clarity, his edge, his strength, but most of all his respect. From her, from others, from himself. Stoicism warns against this deeply. Epictetus reminds us, freedom is the only worthy goal in life. It is won by disregarding things that lie beyond our control. A man who orbits around a woman's validation has given up his freedom, and without freedom, he is not a man, he is an echo. And here's the most brutal irony. Women may like the man who gives everything for them, but they do not respect him, and without respect, love becomes pity, and from pity, there is no return. You were not born to be a servant of moods. You were born to forge meaning from chaos. A man is not measured by how much he is adored. He is measured by the weight of what he builds, the mission he leads, the fire he carries, not just for her, not just for love, but for something higher, something eternal. Because when you betray your mission, you begin to disappear, and when you disappear, love has nothing to hold on to. She cannot follow a man who no longer leads himself. You are not here to be chosen. You are here to choose the life you were born to create. It wasn't her rejection that broke you. It was you leaving yourself behind. He wakes up one day, surrounded by everything he thought he wanted, the nice apartment, the well-paying job, the woman he once begged the universe for. And yet, there's a quiet void inside. It doesn't scream. It hums a low, persistent ache that says, this isn't it. Not because she left, not because life failed him, but because somewhere along the way, he walked away from himself. Otto Weininger described this as the hollow man, a man who becomes empty not from loss, but from misalignment. He may still function, he may still smile, but he's become a stage actor in his own life, living out a performance scripted by others' expectations. And the applause he hoped would fill him only echoes off the walls of his inner silence. We often believe the pain comes from rejection, but rejection is clean, honest. It stings, but it reveals. What truly wounds is self-abandonment, the slow erosion of your soul as you live for attention instead of truth, for comfort instead of clarity, for acceptance instead of authenticity. He used to create for the joy of it. Now he curates for validation. He used to speak from the chest. Now he calculates before every sentence. He used to lead with conviction. Now he follows the emotions of others, afraid to be alone. This is the spiritual numbness of a man who has built a beautiful life on a false foundation. The Stoics warned of this trap. Seneca wrote, "It is not the man who has little, but he who craves more, that is poor." The modern man craves approval, and in craving, he forgets to create. In needing to be seen, he loses the very light worth being noticed for. Carl Jung would say this man is trapped in the projection of love. He doesn't love her. He loves what her attention says about him. Her silence isn't what hurts. It's what it forces him to confront. That the identity he built was never rooted in self, but in performance. And here's the hardest truth. The emptiness will remain, even if she comes back. Even if the world claps louder, because the applause never fills the soul. It only delays the reckoning. So where do you go from here? You stop blaming her silence and start examining your own. You ask, when did I start living to be chosen? What part of myself did I bury to be accepted? Who am I when there is no one watching? This is not about becoming cold. It's about becoming whole. A man who creates because he must, who speaks because he believes, who walks alone, not because he wants to be above others, but because he refuses to be beneath himself. And when he returns to that path, the path of self-respect, everything begins to change. He stops chasing energy that drains him. He stops shrinking for attention. He stops needing and starts choosing. This is where the hollow man becomes whole, not when she loves him, but when he remembers who he was before he forgot himself. You don't need her to approve you. That's when you become untouchable. There's a moment when a man finally steps out of the storm of his own confusion. He's done chasing, done justifying, done bending to be accepted. And in that stillness, he realizes something he couldn't see before. He never needed her approval to be whole. The day he stops seeking it is the day he becomes free. Otto Weininger argued that only the man who no longer needs a woman can be truly free. This sounds extreme, perhaps even bitter to the modern ear, but it isn't about denying love or connection. It's about cutting the chains of emotional dependency that turn love into performance and connection into submission. Most men don't realize they're addicted to approval until it's gone, until the woman they built their identity around walks away, ignores them, or simply stops admiring. That's when the panic rises, because what's collapsing isn't just a relationship, it's their sense of self. Carl Jung warned of this trap. The man who builds his ego on someone else's gaze is building on sand, without the inner anchor of purpose. A man becomes a mirror, a reactor, a reflection of what others project. He may appear confident, but the moment her attention fades, his foundation trembles. The Stoics would see this as a fatal error. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Your mind will take the shape of what you frequently hold in thought. If you obsess over her validation, you will become molded by it. You will lose the shape of your own soul. And worst of all, you will become blind to your own strength." Because the truth is, a man doesn't need permission to live with power. He doesn't need her to think he's worthy. He doesn't need her to call him a good man. He doesn't need anyone to validate what he already knows in his bones. This is what Weininger called the burden of freedom. It's not glamorous, it's heavy. It demands solitude. It demands you look in the mirror and ask, who am I when no one claps? Who am I when no one watches? Who am I when no woman wants me? The weak man collapses. The free man begins. He begins to build not for attention, but for meaning. He begins to speak not to be liked, but to be true. He begins to live not as a performer, but as a sovereign. And suddenly, the world shifts. Women sense something different. He no longer tries to win them. They begin to wonder who he is. He's no longer noisy. He's magnetic. Because that's what happens when a man no longer needs to be chosen. He becomes the one who chooses. Not out of arrogance, but out of alignment. And that alignment is what makes him untouchable, not invincible, but untouchable by manipulation, untouchable by desperation, untouchable by those who only loved the version of him that begged. So what happens now? He lives, he creates, he leads, and if love comes, it comes not to complete him, but to join him. The fire of loneliness is where the real man is forged. Most men spend their lives running from silence, from the hollow echo of being alone, from the still nights where there's no one texting back, no one validating their grind, no one witnessing their effort. But the man who wants to find himself, truly find himself, must eventually stop running. He must stand still in the fire of loneliness and let it burn everything false away. Otto Weininger called this confrontation the crisis of becoming. It's not external chaos that undoes a man, it's the internal reckoning. Who am I without their gaze? Who am I without her approval? Who am I when I stop performing and just exist? The answers don't come with ease. They come through heat, through tension, through the unbearable silence that demands truth. Carl Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And in that darkness, a man meets his most dangerous enemy, not rejection, not women, not failure, but himself. The version of himself he's been avoiding. The version that knows he's lived more for applause than purpose. The version that's exhausted from being who the world expects instead of who he really is. This is the moment most men avoid. They jump to the next relationship, the next hustle, the next dopamine hit, anything but solitude. Because solitude doesn't flatter. It exposes. It strips away the excuses. And yet, it is in that stripping that strength is found. The Stoics understood this. Epictetus taught that freedom begins where need ends. To need her, to need applause, to need constant attention, that's a kind of spiritual slavery. And slavery doesn't produce warriors, it produces dependence. But the man who endures the fire of solitude emerges different. He walks slower not because he's unsure, but because he's unbothered. He speaks less not because he has nothing to say, but because he only says what matters. He loves deeply not because he's desperate, but because he's already full. This man doesn't beg for connection, he offers it. He doesn't panic when alone, he uses the silence to sharpen, while others seek distraction. He forges identity, and what comes out on the other side of that silence is real, is whole, is unshakable. It's not that love isn't welcome, it's that it's no longer required. And that changes everything, because now he chooses women who align, not who entertain. He partners from strength, not from longing. He builds relationships, not dependencies. And when loneliness returns, as it always will in seasons, he doesn't collapse. He welcomes it like an old friend, knowing it's there to refine, not to punish. So if you're standing in the fire right now, don't run. Don't numb it, don't rush it. Let it burn what isn't you. Because the man you meet on the other side is not just real. He's the one you were always meant to be. When you no longer need her, the universe starts aligning with you. Something strange happens when a man no longer needs to be chosen. The world begins to shift. He doesn't become more desirable because he's trying harder. He becomes magnetic because he's trying less and living more. This is what Otto Weininger pointed to when he said that only the man who needs no woman is truly free, because in that moment of energetic detachment, life stops resisting him and starts responding. It's not magic, it's alignment. You're no longer pouring energy into being seen. You're no longer leaking power into fantasies of being understood, desired, or validated. And in that conservation of energy, something deep awakens, clarity. Carl Jung called this the return to the self, not the persona you wear in front of women, not the ego you protect through success, but the essential you, the self that has been drowned in noise, buried under chasing, and now standing alone in silence. He speaks. The man who no longer needs her stops orbiting. He becomes the center. And the law of life is this: whatever stands in its own truth becomes a magnet. Because most people are running, most are hiding, Most are begging to be seen. So when a man finally is, with no performance he shines, not with noise, but with gravity. The Stoics understood this as the harmony of logos, of living in alignment with nature and reason. Marcus Aurelius didn't say, "Go be impressive." He said, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." And when a man is one, not because he wants approval, but because he's guided by principle, he enters the flow. That's when synchronicities appear, not because you forced them, but because you stopped interfering with who you were becoming. Suddenly, the women who once ignored you look differently. The friendships you thought were fading return stronger. Opportunities seem to find you because you are no longer blocking them with desperation. This is what Weininger called the man who lives from eternity. He's not ruled by moods or trends. He's not living for moments. He's anchored in something deeper, a mission, a truth, a reason to rise that doesn't depend on being praised. And, ironically, this man draws love more effortlessly than he ever did while chasing it. Because now, love doesn't feel like salvation. It feels like resonance. It's not someone filling a hole. It's someone recognizing a whole. That's the shift from need to signal. So the next time you feel that urge to prove, to post, to please pause, ask yourself, am I trying to attract her or am I trying to escape myself? Because the man who doesn't escape himself becomes impossible to ignore, not because he's louder, but because he's finally real. Choosing yourself isn't loneliness, it's leadership. They'll call you distant. They'll say you've changed. They might even say you've given up on love. But what they're really feeling is your center solidifying. You are no longer available for manipulation, no longer susceptible to seduction by need, no longer living a life that depends on anyone else's permission. That's not loneliness, that's sovereignty. Otto Weininger believed that a man's highest potential is realized when he stops needing others to confirm his worth. He called this spiritual leadership. It's not about controlling others, it's about owning yourself. And when you do that, your energy shifts. You stop waiting to be picked. You stop waiting to be seen. You become the one who chooses, who acts, who leads not from ego, but from essence. That's what scares people, because a man who chooses himself forces others to confront the parts of themselves they've been avoiding. He doesn't fill roles. He doesn't wear masks. He doesn't play the boy seeking the mother in every relationship. He plays the man, the one who carries himself, without asking to be carried. Carl Jung would say, you've now integrated your shadow. You've stopped denying the parts of you that once frightened others, your intensity, your boundaries, your focus, and you've now brought them into alignment. That's the essence of individuation, becoming whole, not by being perfect, but by becoming complete. The Stoics understood this. Too, Seneca said, if you want to be loved, love yourself first. But he didn't mean the soft, sentimental self-love of modern slogans. He meant the disciplined, unshakable self-respect of a man who keeps promises to himself, who doesn't break when she pulls away, who doesn't beg when things go silent. You are now that man, the one who knows. Loneliness isn't emptiness, it's focus. And that focus has done something miraculous. It's transformed you from a seeker into a signal. Women feel it. They don't know why they're drawn in. It's not the words, not the posture, it's the peace, the absence of desperation, the energy of a man who will love with depth, but not at the cost of his direction. So yes, you may lose people. Yes, some won't understand you anymore. But they were never meant to lead with you, only to test if you'd keep choosing yourself. And you did. That's what real leadership looks like. That's the man the world and the right woman cannot ignore. So take one last look at the version of yourself that once begged to be loved, and thank him. He was the lesson. But you are the legacy.